Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's online event featuring two knowledgeable subject matter experts who will be speaking about the modern day dilemmas of temporary migrant workers. Before we begin today's event, we'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them in this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So within our last month's newsletter poll for N4, the question being, how has COVID impacted your clients that are temporary migrant workers? Some did state that they don't work directly with temporary migrant workers in their role, but for those that did, the majority stated that they were greatly or somewhat affected by this pandemic. So this discussion is very much in line with addressing the issues and concerns that exist, and we look forward to you, the audience, and your participation in this panel discussion. My name is Andrew Tomeyer. I go by the pronouns he, him, and I'm the Education Coordinator with N4. I will be hosting and moderating today's discussion. My co-host is Mariah Maddock, who will be monitoring the Q&A box today. I'm pleased to introduce you to today's panelists. Panelists, I'm going to ask that you turn on your video as I introduce you. Due to a family emergency today, Dr. Salami is unable to join our panel discussion, but we have two great panelists today, Santiago Escobar and Stephanie Mayell. Santiago Escobar is a labor organizer and national representative at the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Canada and coordinator of the Agriculture Workers Alliance, where he advocates for better and safe work environments. He greatly contributes with media outlets with analysis and comments on labor and migrant rights and lobbies with the federal and provincial governments to improve workers' rights and labor standards. Stephanie Mayell is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and has conducted community-based health research with migrant agriculture workers in Ontario and Jamaica since 2014. She's a core member of the Migrant Worker Health Expert Working Group, a team of academics and clinicians who came together in 2020 to address the needs of migrant workers in the Canadian agriculture industry during the COVID-19 pandemic and provide recommendations to federal, provincial, and municipal government agencies. She's currently working on research projects on the health of migrant agriculture workers in Canada at Wilfrid Laurier University and Western University as well. Thank you for joining us today, Stephanie and Santiago. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform. We will share this with you as soon as it becomes available. Should there be any technical issues during this webinar, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. And before we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our platform features to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A window. If you have questions for a specific panelist, please include their name at the start of the question. We know that sometimes many of you might have the same question or be interested in a particular response. Today, you have the option to upvote a question. Please upvote questions that you're interested in hearing the answer to, and we'll prioritize which questions we pose to the speakers first. Our panelists today have no conflicts of interest to declare. So with that said, please turn on your cameras and microphones, Stephanie and Santiago, and we'll jump into today's panel discussion, which will provide in-depth discussion on the current issues facing temporary migrant workers, including, apologies, one second. There we go. Including strategies that can support professionals with this. I will open up with two introductory questions, and then we'll rely on questions from the audience to guide the remainder of the panel discussion with a final wrap-up question at the end. Again, please state who you're directing the question to when you post a question to our Q&A box as well. So our first question to the panelists is this. We've heard many different stories about the issues that temporary migrant workers or temporary foreign workers face when working in Canada, such as barriers to receiving appropriate healthcare, anxieties related to possible unexpected deportation, exploitative working environments, and much more. Please tell us from your experience of the challenges that you have seen that temporary migrant workers face, as well how has COVID-19 exacerbated these concerns? I'll start with Stephanie.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks for inviting us here today to have this important discussion. And so to answer your first question, I would say a variety of challenges have emerged that were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, many of which preceded it. However, some are new to this pandemic and created a lot of challenges. And so to start off with, I would say before the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant workers in Canada faced various barriers to accessing healthcare that include things like long hours of work, limited clinic hours in rural areas, lack of transportation, delays in receiving health cards, lack of information about and integration into local healthcare systems, dependence on employers and resulting confidentiality concerns, and language and literacy barriers. The pandemic exacerbated all of these barriers, and we saw that workers had a hard time not only accessing care, but navigating the healthcare services and the new public health protocols that were requiring them, especially during quarantine, to monitor their health. And so these COVID-19 protocols meant that incoming workers were required to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival. And so we saw an urgent need for health monitoring and general support for workers during this quarantine time. Workers needed more support and close monitoring so that they could complete the COVID-19 tests that they were being asked to do, as well as things like ArriveCAN. And this was especially challenging for non-English speakers. And problematically, a lot of the responsibility to monitor workers' health in some regions fell almost solely on employers, and workers did not have access to healthcare professionals who could answer their questions or help them in this difficult transition time. We also saw that the pandemic gave rise to a practice among employers of illegally restricting the movement of their workforce. And this practice was so widespread, actually, that ESDC last August released a notice to employers reminding them of their migrant workforce's freedom of movement, and sort of laying out the reasons why and the laws that support that freedom. But we did see that these restrictions were ongoing and still are in many cases. And this has meant that workers across Canada have been experiencing food insecurity. They have been unable, especially during the initial quarantine period, but also throughout the season, to do regular grocery shopping, or especially even source the essential items that they need to start working. Items such as work gear, appropriate clothing, and in some cases, personal protective equipment. This situation was made especially challenging due to provincial lockdowns this year. And as a result, many workers were not able to purchase or access the equipment that they needed to stay safe and healthy at work. So we also saw instances of workers needing accessible emergency housing for workers who were without work, who were injured, or who were sick. And in many cases, workers who were injured on the job were not able to access comprehensive or extended health care. And workers who did apply for work permits for vulnerable workers often require emergency housing while they're waiting for the approval period. And so we saw a major issue around internet connectivity and communication technologies in rural areas that prevented workers from, in many cases, participating in the ArriveCAN, in some cases, submitting their COVID-19 tests to begin work. And often this was made worse by large numbers of workers relying on one modem and an inability for employers to interact in person during that time. We also saw that despite the Government of Canada's recent opening of a pathway for permanent residency for essential workers and their increased promotion of the open work permit for vulnerable workers, we saw clearly that these mechanisms are not accessible to workers. They're not easily able to access or especially navigate these services without assistance. And I would just conclude with the need for mental health and wellness supports for workers, because migrant workers have experienced and continue to experience and witness great loss while they're in Canada, such as the loss of a colleague, or in their home country, such as volcanoes and hurricanes. Also, they experience psychological distress in relation to their workplace and employment relationships, as well as in relation to the local environments here in Canada, such as wildfires or COVID outbreaks. And so we really see the need for culturally sensitive mental health supports for workers in accessible languages and formats.
Thank you, Stephanie. So it sounds like there is a lot to consider with regards to how COVID has exacerbated these issues. Mm-hmm. And so I'll pass the question over to Santiago as well. Please tell us your experience of the challenges you've seen that temporary foreign workers face, and how has COVID-19 exacerbated these issues?
Thank you, Andrew. On behalf of the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada, I would like to say thank you for the opportunity to share our work. And also it's important to acknowledge that we are one of the Canada's largest unions, and we are proud and privileged to represent more than 250,000 hardworking people across Canada. And among these workers, we represent migrant workers who are coming under the temporary foreign workers program, working in meat plants and in greenhouses. So during the presentation, we want to share our findings and also some solutions that can be implemented if there is political will by the federal and provincial government. So I think it's important to I totally agree with the context that Stephanie has shared. And I think to build on top of that, I think it's important to understand that these workers, we claim as union advocates and human rights and labor rights advocates, that the core issue of these, what migrant farm workers are experiencing is because the lack of protection they have. So we have a toll-free line, and since the started of the pandemic, we have receiving more or less between 20 to 30 calls per day from across Canada. And when we get these calls, it's because workers are experiencing abuses, because workers, they don't know what to do, how to handle, the pandemic. We have learned workers that are not allowed to leave their farms. I personally met workers that have spent 6 months in a row at the same, at the same farm without being able to go even to get groceries. On top of that, as Stephanie already highlighted, workers living in overcrowded conditions, no inspections. We have learned that the federal government has been assessing the so-called remote inspections by getting just pictures of the houses rather than sending in inspectors. They were just receiving even 3 years old pictures from a house. So once they pass the so-called virtual inspection, they allow the employers to receive workers. And as we already know, the outcome is that many of these workers, I'll give an example. In the Windsor-Essex County, we have identified about over 3,000 temporary foreign workers in agriculture that have contracted the virus, COVID-19, because they couldn't practice physical distancing, because they didn't get any mask, nor information on, what to do during the pandemic. But I think it's important to put in context that non-unionized workers, including migrant workers, are governed by the Employment Standards Act by province, which provides the minimum standards for most employees, such as a minimum wage, breaks, and weekends. This is pretty much what is, all non-unionized workers are governed by the Employment Standards Act. Employees who are not protected by a union can be fired or disciplined at any time, and the employer doesn't need to have a good reason for taking action against them. And I think it's important to understand the context, because these workers, that doesn't have any protection. And if you are a temporary foreign worker, you don't speak the language, you are even in a most precarious working condition. So when workers are unionized, they are covered with a collective agreement by the Provincial Labor Relations Act, in the case of Ontario, the Ontario Labor Relations Act. And a collective agreement is a binding document that the employer must comply with. So this is very, very important to understand, because we heard a lot of complaints from workers because, they want to, and they're totally fair. Their complaints are totally fair because they want their rights to be respected. But if they don't have a mechanism, it's almost impossible to be protected against unscrupulous employers. I'm not saying that all employers are bad, but we're talking about unscrupulous employers. So agricultural workers they're excluded from the Ontario Labor Relations Act, and in Alberta, they're excluded from the Labor Relations Code, meaning that they cannot join a union. So this is very important to understand. So these workers right now are excluded from the Labor Relations Act. This creates vulnerability and essentially denies the ability of workers to exercise fundamental labor rights. And basically, they're totally, very vulnerable. To give you an example, in Ontario, where the majority of migrant agricultural workers are, about 25,000 agricultural migrant workers, they are protected by the so-called Agricultural Employees Protection Act. And like I said before, they don't have the right to join a union. Under this act, workers can form an association, but not unions, and it's up to the employer if they want to recognize the union or not. So under this act, agricultural workers can work every day for months without days off. This is well documented in the open work permits. We have assisted over 134 applications where, every time a migrant worker gets an open work permit granted by the federal government is because the government is acknowledging that these workers have experienced abuses. So it's very, very problematic to learn that these workers, many of these workers have been working non-stop without time off for a period of 6 months, because under the act, this is legal. So imagine during COVID, right? So under the Agricultural Employees Protection Act, workers are not entitled to overtime pay nor mandatory holidays. So it's very common that workers are working during, holidays or Saturday or Sundays. Under this act, farm workers can be terminated at any time, local workers and migrant workers without a just cause. And this is also a shocking data. The Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs Appeal Tribunal in Ontario, that was created in 2002, has received only 3 complaints of the, complaints from workers. So 3 complaints, and all these have been filed by UFCW. So in the same period, the Labor Relations Board has received thousands of complaints. This shows that this act is not there to protect agricultural workers. This is to give you an example. In Alberta, it was workers were excluded from the Labor Relations Act, I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, since the new premier took over power. And workers don't complain before this tribunal because they know that under this act can be subject to retributions and have no protections. So consequently, we continue to encounter cases like that. To give you an example, in 2018, we assisted a group of migrant agricultural workers who were victims of human trafficking. They were recruited in Leamington and they were exploited for over a year in the London area. In 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, a second group of migrant workers, also victims of human trafficking, were exploited in an illegal cannabis operation. So, and a couple of months ago, workers from Alberta escaped from a farm where they were being exploited and traveled all the way to Leamington, Ontario. They spent 3 days, and some of them paid $2,000 to be, taken from Alberta to Leamington. They contacted our union, UFCW, for support. Their documentation, including their passports, have been retained by the employer, which is illegal, can be considered a case of human trafficking. We had to contact their RCMP to get assistance in recuperating these workers' passports. These and other documented cases show that migrant agricultural workers do not have confidence in the current system and are either too afraid to come forward for assistance or unaware of how to come forward. Moreover, experiences with authorities in some sending countries may further deter migrant workers from turning to officials for help in Canada, and also because the language barrier is almost impossible if you don't speak the language to communicate in English or French. And usually the tip line that the government has implemented, it has only a recording, so you have to leave a message. So if you're experiencing abuses and you feel very vulnerable, it's very unlikely that you will report any kind of abuses. And also to put it in context, in 2010, the International Labour Organization, ILO, which is part of the UN, questioned Canada and Ontario over their legislation regarding agricultural workers. National and multi-provincial labor codes specifically prohibit agricultural workers from organizing, especially in unions. The ILO has determined that this violates the human rights to free association, as well as the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedoms. I'm gonna leave it there.
Well, yeah, thank you. And it sounds like exploitative practices exist among both, but those that aren't unionized appear to have a much higher risk of experiencing such a problematic practices in their work. Thank you for that. To move to our second question, what promising practices have you seen and can share with and address concerns from temporary migrant workers? This can include how to appropriately address labor law infractions, work that's been done to improve the work environment, the examples such as yourself where they're retaining passports without illegally, and other efforts to help temporary foreign workers. This time I'll start with Santiago.
Like I said before, we thought that during COVID things will change because of this horrible pandemic, but unfortunately we have seen the opposite, and during the pandemic we have been assisting workers in especially those who were in a very precarious condition, such as the ones who, for instance, contracted COVID and they didn't get any support, they didn't get any information. So they were, many cases well documented that when the first thing we did when we got a call like that, we informed the local health unit to make sure that these workers are in their radar and these workers will get some support, because unfortunately, many unscrupulous employers didn't report when workers contracted COVID. So to give an example, operation that had 3 houses with 20 workers in each house, we're talking about of 60 workers, and the employer didn't inform that it was a COVID outbreak at this farm. So we got in touch with the local health unit. They sent some inspectors, then they were able to provide healthcare, and these workers got some medical attention. Some of them were even moved to a hospital because of their health conditions. And these workers, after they quarantine for 14 days, or in some cases for 3, or in some cases for even 4 weeks without income, we assisted many workers to obtain SERF benefits. These workers are entitled to receive workers' compensation, but our experience with workers' compensation is that it will take a while to get it approved. As a unionized worker, we have a team of WSIB specialists, workers' compensation specialists across Canada, so they will take care of that. But if you are not unionized, if you're a temporary foreign worker, you don't speak the language, and your employer is not taking care of that application, it's very unlikely that you will get any sort of financial compensation. So we assisted over 150 workers to obtain SERF, because SERF, it was a matter of just making a call, and in 5 minutes they will get the benefits approved. So this is one thing that we lobby the federal government, that these workers should have access to employment insurance, because they're paying into it, but they're not allowed to get any benefits out of employment insurance. So finally, during the pandemic, these workers have now access to sickness benefits, which is positive, because they've been excluded from the employment insurance program. And once these workers were able to back to work, to get some financial compensation, a lot of these workers call us and say, look, I'm not happy with the company, I'm done with the company, I want to leave the company. So we have assisted these workers to obtain open work permits, which is also a program that the federal government introduced back in June 2019. So since then, we have assisted over 130 temporary foreign workers, most of them in agriculture, to obtain open work permits. And the process to obtain open work permits, for those who are not familiar with the program, these workers are tied to one employer. They don't have labor mobility. So when they arrive in Canada, they have to work for Johnson's farms, and they cannot leave that farm. If they want to leave this farm, they have to prove that they have been experiencing abuses, which is very problematic because we have been advocating from the last 30 years that part of the solution is that workers, this kind of, temporary foreign workers, they should have open work permits or at least sectorial work permits, path to permanent residency, and also, have representation, because as Stephanie has highlighted already, these workers are very precarious and a very precarious position. So we claim that if these workers have representation, if these workers have labor mobility, they will be less vulnerable and precarious. So talking about this new program, which is, we call it a Band-Aid because really doesn't address the core issues of temporary foreign workers. Is good, of course. We welcome that initiative because for those who are experiencing abuses, to have the possibility to leave a bad employer is positive. And the process is very complicated, even if you speak the language, even if you are familiar with IT, technologies, computers, and everything, it's complicated to submit an application. So we spend between 10 to 15 hours per case because we have to assist the worker to tell their story, to produce evidence, to gather evidence. It's a complicated process, right? And during COVID, we cannot meet in person with these workers, so all the process is over the phone. So luckily, our union is supporting these workers. Some of them, another problem they're experiencing is that once they have obtained an open work permit, basically it's very complicated to find an employer because we are witnessing right now as we speak that employers are blacklisting these workers, because if you show open work permit means that you have reported your employer. So employers don't want that kind of employees because they can be labeled as troublemakers. So this is another problem that is coming out of the open work permit, which is a Band-Aid, which is a very long-term solution because there's a 1-year open work permit and cannot be renewed. So now we are witnessing other issues coming out of this program. So the rate of workers out of these 130 workers, only 6% of these workers were able to find a new employer and get back into the temporary foreign workers employers. So the temporary foreign workers program, sorry. So the majority of these workers who obtain an open work permit are in a, back in a precarious condition because they were not able to find a new employer. So some of them are without status again. So we have informed these and shared all our concerns before the federal government. So we're still waiting to get back. Hopefully they will extend their open work permits, or hopefully I think it's the time to implement open work permits, or at least sectorial work permits.
Thank you. So it sounds like the lobbying efforts that you and your organization have done have led to some good help and support to temporary foreign workers during this past pandemic, but there are still some solutions that still need to be determined at a policy level. So thank you for that. To pass the question over to Stephanie, what promising practices have you seen and can share?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Santiago. I'm going to build a little bit off of what Santiago was just talking about with the open work permit for vulnerable workers. One thing that I thought was notable to learn this year is that actually not all workers who submit an application will be approved. Some workers are unable to demonstrate their abuse. So specifically, the government requires workers to provide certain forms of evidence to support their claim. And one of those includes to be a legal affidavit. But we've seen that in cases where workers are not providing a picture or an audio recording, they're not necessarily able to even get the open work permit. And so I was surprised, to be honest, to learn that there would be this rate of denial of applications. And then to sort of also build on what Santiago was mentioning about, once workers are free of their employer and free technically to find a new job, the job bank that exists is not accessible, and it does not allow for a worker to transition into work, which is the whole reason why they're here. And so around promising practices there, I would definitely say the UFCW is doing a wonderful job in supporting large numbers of workers. I also know that another organization, Justice for Migrant Workers, is supporting a lot of Caribbean workers who are looking for the same kinds of supports with the open work permit. And workers' compensation as well. That's another thing that I see workers need so much assistance with, and it's not a short amount of time or a small amount of time, it's ongoing, because the workers' compensation systems across provinces are innately unfair to workers, but especially so to non-statused workers like migrant workers, who are subject to repatriation and deportation oftentimes in times of injury and illness, intentionally before they're able to submit a claim to a workers' compensation system. And sort of these kinds of abusive and unscrupulous practices are made possible by the nature of this program. And in fact, it's almost, it's hard to be generous to employers and to the system itself when we see so many workers are injured. And this year, I mean, we've seen at least 8 workers die this season. That has made some media. So the work of support organizations, and I mean, also the Industrial Accident Victims Group, or IAVGO, and Watari out of BC are just a couple I'd also like to acknowledge, because they do a phenomenal job in addressing sort of workers' holistic concerns when they find themselves in a time of need. Often they need healthcare, they need compensation, they need navigations assistance, they need practical assistance in understanding what's happening and what each process will look like. A couple other amazing efforts that I think exist are a few of the community health centers in Southern Ontario operate healthcare services specifically for migrant workers in the region. And they've designed the service provision around the social determinants of health of this population. So they're offering primary care services at times and in locations and languages that are accessible to workers. And I think that's made a big difference, but it does also expose some challenges for follow-up care, because we see diagnostic services and specialists don't have those same kinds of accommodations. And then we also have noted, or I have noted, many churches across Ontario and across the country play really leading roles in providing supports to workers through a variety of services. And in the context of COVID, we've seen that that looks like food banks and clothing drives and hubs where workers can congregate and pick up the essential items that they otherwise aren't able to get. And we even see some really interesting cases where congregation members have come together to provide healthcare services to workers in some places. And then I think in my last notable, or one of the last things I can think of, is some public health units have gone to some efforts to increase the accessibility of their housing complaint mechanisms for workers, and have done some exceptional work in their reaching out to employers to be sure that the migrant workforce is provided with a list of local services so that they are able to navigate some of the local services, even if they've never worked in that area before. So it's also notable that workers may be hired on a single work permit and tied to an employer, but that employer can transfer them to colleagues around the province. And so we can sometimes see workers working in 2 or 3 areas in a year, and they have no control over where they go. So they may have worked in one region for 10 years and have been integrated into that community, at least enough that they know where to access services, and then find themselves the following year arriving in some completely strange and unknown place where they do not know where to access healthcare. And when we see in Canada important things like healthcare, workers' compensation, employment standards, these are administered at the province level. So workers who have worked previously in, say, Ontario and find themselves in Nova Scotia now have a little bit of a learning curve to see what's available to them and to understand those systems.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for that. So it's essentially, there's still these ongoing issues with this open work permit, whether it's not just getting it, but also being potentially denied of it. And the power of those that are out there helping, providing that support where they can, but there is still some elements that need to be kind of worked on to help with adjustment and to those that are moving from one province to another with respect to potential for work and such. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Those are both very informative responses. So let's move to our Q&A, and we have a few here. So this one's to Stephanie, and you touched on it a little bit. Are there any plans in place for these migrant workers to apply for permanent residency? Now, you discussed the pathway to permanent residency, but perhaps being able to elaborate on that.
Sure. Yeah. So IRCC recently announced, I think it was a total of 90,000 positions in a pathway called the TR to PR. So temporary residence to permanent residence. And it was targeted for groups that are already in Canada. So international students and migrant farm workers were included as essential workers. And then there's also health workers. And each of those categories had a certain number of applications that were allowed to be accepted. And so we did see that the essential worker stream was open to migrant workers in the agricultural sector. However, a number of issues presented themselves immediately that meant that that was very much more lip service than reality, especially if workers found themselves in places like the East Coast, the maritime provinces. One of the requirements, well, there's a series of requirements to apply, and it looked like language testing, biometrics and medical. And those are essential first few steps. And in many regions, workers couldn't even access a language testing center. So even if they otherwise qualified and had the financial capital, I mean, it's hundreds of dollars and more than $1,000. And so we see workers, and if the family is large, it can get very, very costly. So we see workers through the year really getting excited about this announcement and then learning that in their area, they're not able to do the language test. Or another issue that emerged was that seasonal workers who wish to apply for it may not have their applications ruled on before the end of their work permit. And if they were to return home to preserve their status, they would null and void the application. And so some caveats were made, and there is now a work permit that will allow, a bridging work permit that will allow anyone with an application under review to stay. But it was a very costly endeavor. So many workers wanted to apply and were not able to for a variety of reasons. And it really, it created a little bit of distress among the community in terms of how they understood it to be available to them, and then having to learn the practical reasons why they may not or will not be able to apply. So that's the recent, it was more of a pilot or a special, and part of the motivation I think for that was that IRCC set immigration goals for 2021 in the midst of a pandemic where we have restricted income. So it does make sense to open that pathway up to those who are already here, but it makes even more sense to open it up in an accessible way that includes the barriers that essentially migrant workers faced across the country. And then there's also other, I mean, yeah, we need more accessible routes to PR because there really aren't any. And that's not to say that all workers, you know, want to come and stay and settle their families here in Canada, but many would like the opportunity. And a lot of the dialogue in the media around status and PR, you know, we're really also having a second dialogue around workers having all of the rights associated with status. And that's part of the other argument as well, because as Santiago duly noted, they exist in this subcategory where they're so open to exploitation and abuse and so unprotected by the systems that do exist. So I don't know if that answered the question explicitly about PR. You know, workers are always looking to understand how they might come here and establish a life. And for seasonal workers, that's just not a realistic possibility for many workers.
Yeah, if I may, I also would like to share some of our experiences we have achieved through collective agreements. So in the meat packaging sector, UFCW has negotiated and implemented union contract language that secures access to ESL classes and support, because if you don't speak the language, even though you have all the requirements, you won't be able to qualify to get PR. And also, we have been able to negotiate employers' sponsorship to temporary foreign workers. So these workers can pursue permanent residency opportunities through the provincial nominee program, which is the case in Alberta and Manitoba. So thank you to our collective agreements, more than 4,000 migrant workers have obtained permanent residency status, and in many cases have become Canadian citizens, well, in the majority of the cases. This is a win-win for workers, the industry, local communities, and the country as a whole. So we have shared these experiences before the federal, provincial government, during consultations at the parliament, you name it. So if the federal government really wants to, address their issues and to give response, meaningful response to their issues, this is one of the available solutions that have been already, we have set precedents and are available. So this is why we are also demanding that the temporary foreign workers program, the government who is owning the program, should make mandatory that these workers will be protected by a union, because without representation, it's very unlikely that employers will respect their rights. And in Quebec, we just a week ago organized 3 greenhouses. We're talking about 400 new members, most of them from Guatemala. We already represent about 1,000 migrant agricultural workers in Quebec. And during the pandemic, these workers were the only agri-food essential workers to receive a premium pay. We were able to negotiate a premium pay for our members at grocery stores and other essential workers at food facilities, but agricultural workers were excluded from a premium pay during the pandemic. But, thanks to our collective agreements, these workers were able to get premium pay and also a bonus at the end of the year, plus other benefits of being protected by a collective agreement.
Great. Oh, good. That's good. And so that's some elements related to how, but as Stephanie said, there are the issues as well that exist. So our following question was, for temporary migrant workers that are here with life-sustaining therapies, such as dialysis, for example, do they have the opportunity to receive permanent residency on compassionate grounds or any sort of related to that? So it wasn't directed at any specific person, but feel free to go ahead.
So I would say technically the answer to that should be yes. If a worker is injured or suffers a health emergency here, so it's like workers are entitled to healthcare in Canada as a function of their contract. And so in the case when a worker is egregiously injured or extremely sick, yes, the agency PR application is open as an option. I recently learned of a worker who had an egregious brain injury and paralyzing PTSD as a result of the conditions of his accident, who was denied. And so I would say one of the issues I've learned then is there's some subjectivity to that process that is troubling. The individual who's reading that individual application has a lot of discretion over whether it's approved. Also, whether workers can afford the kind of legal supports required to produce a robust and fully adequate application that's just not accessible to a lot of workers. And that's where a lot of support groups come in, like legal support groups, community legal. They have to help at every process. I mean, there's a lot of paperwork involved in the agency in terms of government forms, but also some real historical requirements. And so when a worker is injured here, they don't often have all of that paperwork or ability to source all of the documents required. So it can be a very long, complicated, and stressful process. And also if they're a seasonal worker, You have to worry too about status. While you're processing that H&C PR app, you've got to find a way to get them legally here. That usually looks like visitors visas, but again, we're not 100%, there's no guarantee that you will be approved. And so we see a lot of also mental health effects come out in times of injury, or when workers, they're fearing deportation. They know that they are not able to access the kinds of care they need at home, but the process of getting that visitor's visa and understanding an H&C and meeting its requirements and adequately doing an application, it's really difficult and very, very time consuming and expensive. So often a worker could qualify for legal aid, but the hours that they're given through a legal aid certificate only cover a portion of the time required to truly properly prepare this H&C application. And so it does require a team effort oftentimes between different advocacy groups, some providing legal assistance, some providing settlement style supports, others providing practical life navigations, and in some cases, mental health supports on top of all of that. All of which can be made extremely difficult. I do my research with Caribbean workers, but this becomes an even more complicated process when it's a non-English speaker. The Canadian system is not especially friendly to non-English and non-French speakers through its portals and things like that. So that's the H&C conundrum. I mean, I know it's a difficult process for anyone, but for migrant workers, it creates a few other layers that they need to consider. And maybe Santiago has some more to add to that.
You summarized everything. So unfortunately, it's very complicated process. We have assisted workers with, who were injured at work or suffer an accident, and to obtain a H&C, which is under the compassionate grounds application, humanitarian compassionate grounds application is. Will take probably about 2 years to get that. And during that time, you will need, as Stephanie just highlighted, a team of people to be able to assist the working in many issues. Our experience I was able to assist a worker 4 years ago. He suffered an accident at work because the tractor didn't have a security button that you press the button in case that the tractor doesn't work properly or it fell down. So this worker, her foot was compromised, and half of his foot was amputated. So during this time, we partnered with Legal Assistance of Windsor because they were able to take care of the immigration piece. We were able to file the WSIB claim and assist the worker and make all the arrangements so the wife was able to come over to take care of the worker. So we secure payment first, because without payment, you cannot cover your basic needs such as food, transportation, rent, you name it. So once the financial piece was secured, then we moved to the second part, which was the immigration piece, and that was in charge of Legal Assistance of Windsor. But my understanding is that it took over 2 years to get to get the process done and get the permit granted. So it's very complicated.
Oh, well, yeah, I can imagine. And one of the questions we did have for you, Santiago, was you mentioned a support line for temporary foreign workers. Would you be able to please share that number with the attendees here?
Yes, let me share it right now.
Thank you.
So just so you know, we have for those calling from Mexico, we do have a line. So I'm going to share it right now.
Okay.
And also for those calling within Canada, we have another line. So it's toll-free line and operates pretty much 24/7.
Thank you. And to add to the previous question, what would you recommend for a pregnant temporary foreign worker whose insurance covers only emergency help, but not support services during the pregnancy? The employer is not interested to pay and support her.
The worker is here in Canada, is that?
For the anonymous attendee, is the worker in Canada? Feel free to add that into the Q&A box.
And the province would be good to know too, if they are.
Okay.
So I would say, you know, if they're in Ontario, community
Yes,
health.
and in Nova Scotia. Sorry, Andrew.
Okay, in Nova Scotia. So a little bit of a tricky situation. So healthcare is broken down by province, and workers are entitled to provincial healthcare while they're in Canada. That should include prenatal services. They also are provided extended healthcare through a third-party insurer. It's called Cowan Insurance. A lot of workers don't know they have extended benefits. It's not a super comprehensive thing, but it does include things like emergency dental, emergency eye care. I'm not 100% sure if it's explicitly states something in there for prenatal care, but I can't think that it should. I mean, I think the provincial healthcare services are something that they should be able to access. So given that I know there's a large number of Caribbean workers in Nova Scotia, I would be happy to, you know, help strategize a solution to this particular issue if the anonymous person would like to email me. Yeah, I can strategize after I've reached out to a couple of my contacts in Nova Scotia. But as far as I know, the provincial healthcare services, which include prenatal care, should qualify here. Maybe Santiago, have you heard anything around care for pregnant women being limited by province or?
It's complicated to access to you know, maternal or parental benefits out of employment insurance. So you have to follow criteria, and basically you must be taking care of the newborn, the little one, and you have 1 year to be able to apply. And the benefits will end at the end of the year. So every year on December 15, because those coming under the temporary foreign workers program, seasonal agricultural workers program, their social insurance number will expire on December 15th, meaning that once you don't have a valid social insurance number, you're not entitled to receive benefits. So meaning that you have to, the closer you are to December 15, the less benefits you will get. So that was introduced by the federal government, I don't know, 5 years ago. So basically this amendment of the regulation now is limiting workers, excluding workers to get parental and maternal benefits. So basically, to give an example, if you had a baby that was born in 2020 and you're claiming it was born in let's say January of this year, and the worker worked for 6 months here and returned to the country in July, maybe the worker will qualify and entitled to get benefits up to December 15. But most of these workers are, you know, going back home at the end of the season, which is September, October, November. So you will end up with little benefits if you qualify to get benefits. So it's a very complicated process, and even if you speak the language, will be complicated. So imagine if you don't speak the language, you don't understand the process. It's basically another barrier that temporary foreign workers are experiencing.
Okay, and I'm not sure, Andrew, if the question was around healthcare or compensation, but both ways. Was it around healthcare here in Ontario or here in Nova Scotia?
It was related to healthcare in Nova Scotia, or healthcare insurance coverage, but not coverage specific to prenatal services. But it sounds like there is a little bit from what you had stated, and we will very much connect yourself to our anonymous individual after this discussion. And noting the time, there have been a ton of questions. So thank you to the audience for being very, very involved in this discussion today. And we will very much take these questions to our meeting place on the N4 platform. But we're going to wrap up with one final question to Stephanie and Santiago. And that is, if there's one thing, whether that's at the local provincial or national level, or even international level, that we could start doing today to support temporary migrant workers, both during and after this pandemic? What would that be and why? So I'll start with Stephanie on this one.
So try as I might, I could not identify one thing because it would be at the expense of so many others. So I've collected a list of things I think would be the most important things to do. And I mean, in terms of support, really, that would be looking like bringing these issues up, especially it's election time, making sure that we think about the needs of workers while we're thinking about the future of Canada. And so those things would be: one, we need to end these closed work permits. Indentured labor is not acceptable. We need to increase access to permanent residency for workers who want to bring their families here. Many workers come for decades, 30 years, and then end up sending their children here as international students under also precarious status. We need a national housing standard that prioritizes workers' health and dignity and includes real consequences for non-compliant employers. And we desperately need the establishment of effective anti-reprisal mechanisms so that workers who are vulnerable to abuse are not structurally subject to that abuse. That's my one-ish thing.
That's all right. That was a great list. And I'll pass it over to Santiago.
I think it's important that these workers get representation. So the only way to be able to, to get your labor rights, human rights respected is by having a collective agreement. So as a union, we have thousands of precedents. We have said already, set precedents. We claim that if workers in agriculture, if they are able to join a union, to have a collective agreement, they will be able to negotiate job security, benefits, wage increases, overtime. And every time they will negotiate a new collective agreement, they will be able to build on top of what they already have achieved. So that's the only way to improve labor standards in an industry. I give you an example. In the meat plants, we have been able to negotiate 25 pay sick days per year in some cases. Seniority rights, just cause protection. So these workers cannot be terminated. These workers have pension plan. They have benefits. They can, even with the sponsor of the employer and the union, go through the provincial nominee program and get permanent residencies. So that's something that is tangible, is real, that is here available to these workers. So we're demanding that, the federal government to make union representation a necessary condition to protect temporary foreign workers in Canada. Also provide open work permits, or at least sectorial work permits. So workers within agriculture will be able to have labor mobility, and also flexible paths to permanent residency.
Thank you. Thank you. Those have been very, very good responses. And our audience would very much thank you if we gave them the voice to say thanks as well. So to close out, thank you very much to our panelists for taking the time to participate in today's discussion. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Santiago. And many thanks to you, the audience, for your participation and your questions and joining us. And the engagement has been great. And I hope you've all learned a lot more about the impact COVID is having to temporary migrant workers and the possible strategies to address questions and concerns that exist. And I know that I certainly have. So this has been very informative. Thank you. And you're welcome to join us again for our upcoming events, such as September 8th and September 22nd. And if you missed any part of today's presentation or would like to watch this session again, we will be posting this recording to the N4 platform within the next week or so. And we want to continue the dialogue that this panel has started. And from the many, many questions we received, we'll be moving them all to our N4's online moderated discussion forum called The Meeting Place on our N4 website. And we've invited our panelists, including Dr. Salami, who wasn't able to make it today, to respond to your questions there. We've also curated several resources related to today's webinar topic from a variety of our partners, and you can find these in our resource toolkit, and we will link them when we share the on-demand version. So if you haven't yet, please sign up to newcomernavigation.ca for all our resources and learning opportunities. Along with that, following this session, you'll be invited to complete a survey to share your feedback with N4. These surveys help us continuously improve and seek out new webinar content and opportunities that are responsive to the topics that you, our N4 members, are interested in, and those that are involved with whether it's temporary migrant workers or newcomers across Canada. We kindly ask that you follow the link and complete this brief survey. And before we close out, once again, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Santiago, for your participation in today's discussion. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We hope that you can join us again at a future N4 event. Stay safe, stay well, and have a good day. Take care.